So we still have some light issues. I am charging my light because I was not prepared for this today. I didn't think I was gonna tell stories, but then I told a story time about the chismes in my family. Yay, we have light! Se hizo la luz. The light has become a part of our story. Okay, so this is part 2 to the stories that I grew up with. Spooky. I'm not ooh. Yeah, for anybody that doesn't know, these are part of all of these are part of Los Cuentos del Finado Jose. So to tell you the story, I need to tell you, and this might be the intro. To tell you the story, I need to tell you about traveling down the road, right? And it's not like the roads in Venezuela. It's not like the roads here in the United States where the light is like everywhere, right? Much like my room right now, the light keeps coming on and off. That those are the roads in Venezuela. And I grew up with cousins that loved to scare me. We used to have a little witch, and it was like just a pincushion of a witch. And everybody and their mother was always scared of that witch for some reason. Um, and like they used to scare me with that witch. The point being, so you get the idea of what kind of family I grew up in. Um, and they sorry, I have something in my like the hair never is hairy. Um, so you're traveling down the road, right? And the roads are actually really dark. But it's like it's not just dark, it's like pitch dark. Because as you like leave Caracas, so Caracas is a valley surrounded by a mountain, right? Like it's surrounded by El Avila. But it's really just like a valley. And at the bottom of the valley is the city of Caracas. And all surrounding it are mountains. So to get out of Caracas, you need to go up. You need to go around the mountain. You know, you need to go up the mountain to get out of the valley. Um, and so, but imagine like the road as you're elevating, just pitch dark because many of these lights sometimes don't get like serviced and they're not like it's so it's just this dark road, and you're like surrounded by mountains and jungle. um it's just like a really it's an amazing connection to nature. But a lot of these stories kind of were birthed out of like the oh it died were birthed out of this situation. Oh my god, it's so dark. I don't know why that's okay. Let's see if we can take it. Okay. Yeah, it's not looking good. All right. So let's take this one out because I don't think it's like helping us. Sorry. I was trying to set up. So a lot of these stories were birthed out of the stories of just being in the dark, right? So apparently we have this uncle in the family, long deceased, right? Therefore, los cuentos del finado Jose. Finado means dead or deceased Jose. And he used to tell these amazing, scary stories, right? Things that would happen to him, mostly because he was a philandering drunkard that would go to every bar. And then all these weird things would happen to him. It was almost like he could see through dimensions, right? Like, so we went through like el cuento de what's her name? La Sayona, right? Like where he was coming out of a bar and he like met La Sayona. And for anybody who doesn't know who La Sayona is this long legend um of this woman who was like one of the most beautiful women in her town, right? Some people trace the story back to indigenous, to kind of colonial indigenous stories. That was not the version that I was told, that she was indigenous. the story that I was told was, yes, it was during the colonial period, but that she was like this really beautiful woman in this small town in, like in like I guess the savannah, where people kind of own cattle, all these things, right? It was part of that culture. And men far would come from far and wide because she was so beautiful. Like the stories of her beauty would like transcend cities, right? And she fell in love from a man from the capital, Caracas, right? And it was this like, wealthy landowner, and they got married, they had children. And in some cases, in some stories, like she was told by a former spurned lover, right? That her husband and her mother were having an affair. And so she's like, at this point, she had children, all of this. And she like, and there's different versions of the story throughout all of Caracas, but in one version she does catch them, that the story was in fact true. And so she takes an axe, she burns the house that her children and her husband were in, and then she goes to her mother's house and she kills the mother with an axe. In other stories, the story wasn't true. This man just wanted to have her at any cost possible. And so she still goes to, like, out of the fury of thinking that her husband would cheat on her with her mother, she ended up, again, same thing, kind of burning alive the children and the husband, and unaliving the mom with an axe. And while her mother was kind of, so she attacked her with the axe, as her mother is trying to crawl away from her, the mother curses her, right? And she curses her to like live forever, in penance. And so the story that I told in the previous version was the story of this uncle who had found her. And all the instances and these stories like have throughout ages, right? This legend is that when you see her, she only comes to philandering men, and that as you see her, you see a beautiful, beautiful woman in like the distance. And sometimes she'll allow you to walk with her, and as you walk with her, she never says anything. And it's usually men who are in on some level of an inebriation. And as you walk with her, she gets taller and taller and taller and taller. And when she finally faces you, she has like these long, like has these long fingers, almost like claws, and these long like fangs. And she is no longer beautiful. She's like this ugly, ugly, you know, I don't know, even monster. And that's usually when men either pass out, are never heard from again, disappear. And that is the story of La Sayona. And go back to the previous Los Cuentos del Finado Jose to hear her story, his story of how he met her. So, this Uncle Jose had many stories like that, so many. But the one and then I told you about the one about my mother. So in the family, we have a lot of these stories, many of which were, lived through. I told you the story of the little dead girl and my mom seeing like a little blanket kind of crossing the threshold of the doorway when she passed away. I'm like getting like chills. When at the same time the little girl passed away. I told that story. Now I'm going to tell another story from Finado Jose. So this story, much like the previous stories, was after a day of working hard in the field. These were all like landowners or people, people who helped in the land of like, of ganaderia, which is basically, you know cattle, right? Cattle herding. And so they would go to their local bar. And so my uncle went to the local bar to blow off some steam. That's what they would do. It's a small town. Um, and he went to the local bar and he started drinking and dancing. Meanwhile, his wife was at home, and having fun, right, with the local women. What was interesting is once they kicked him out, it came the time when he had to go back home. Instead of like having learned his lesson from previous iterations of the story, he started walking home in those dark, uh, roads. And these were, back in the day, were dirt roads. There weren't any lights. You would go by the light of the moon. And the thing about Venezuela is that Venezuela holds like this strange magic, right? Like there's the jungle holds like a very, in fact, like um one of our most famous writers, who wrote, oh, I can't remember. I completely blanked. But he received a Pulitzer Prize for this story. And he would say in his novel, he wrote in his novel that there was like a certain magic about the wilderness of Venezuela, and that there was like this sense of this sense of like wildness about it, right? And anybody who's ever been to like the Amazons, that's basically the feeling that they get from it. And so this he leaves the bar, right? And he's walking down, and all of a sudden he feels like he's being followed. But he doesn't see anything. He turns around, he's like, "Oh, that's weird." And he's like cutting through the brush because he's like, "That's weird. I'm going to lose whoever it is in the brush, right? In through the jungle, through the trees." But he still feels like something behind him. And he starts running for no reason, but he feels like he's being followed and he feels like he's being preyed on, right? Like that sense of like, oh my God, I have to get out of here, right? And all of a sudden, like everything goes quiet in the jungle or in the woods, wherever he was. And he turns around, and that's when he sees it. He sees like this, I don't know, disembodied urn. Not an urn like where you put like the dead body, the casket. He sees this casket just following him, like in midair, like magic. And he starts running faster and faster and faster and faster. And this thing is keeping up with him, and it's gaining on him. And as it's gaining on him, Finado Jose falls and blacks out. And again, he is found sometime in the next morning, um, looking none the worse for wear. But nonetheless, that's the story. I don't remember if in the previous one I told the story of like my mom. I think I did, but let me just kind of go over it a little bit. So my mom had two sisters, And so it was, and my grandfather had a lot of family. My grandmother not so much, because when her parents were from Spain, they came over during, like, up historically around the time of, like, of the cold, of the, not the cold flu, sorry, the Spanish flu. So they came around the time of the Spanish flu, and they bought some land, and they started, like, they started like a farm of sorts. At least that's the story I was told. And when my my great grandmother already had children, um, but she went on to have more children, and that last time that she went to have, my grandmother was around like 5, 4 or 5, when her mom kind of got pregnant. And when her mom got pregnant, she she passed away in childbirth, which happens a lot, especially in, like, out in the wilderness in the middle of nowhere. These weren't places with hospitals or anything like that. Um, she passes away, and they had so many kids, which was, typical of the period and of the place and time. Um, that the father, after the mom passed away, started giving away kids to whoever wanted somebody, needed a kid to work for them. And my grandmother was one such kid. So around that period of time, 4 or 5 years old, she was sent to work for a family. And I'm not told too much about that period of time, but for all intents and purposes, she never sees her family again. She never sees her father again. Her mother had recently passed away, and then she gets given away, to work as a servant, um, for a house, for a nearby house, you know. And so she would say, like, how she would, like, wake up at the crack of dawn, and she would, like, get the corn, and she would mill mill the corn. um I'm a city girl, I'm sorry, I know nothing about that. And she was, 5 years old. She was a baby. um but anyway, she eventually, meets my grandfather, an Afro Latino, and they have children. They move to the city, um, to Caracas, and but my grandfather had a lot of family. So my grandmother did not have any connection to any family, but my grandfather had a really large family. And so like they would spend every summer going from family member to family member, kind of like visiting. They would go to the local beaches, and all of that stuff. And so in one such time, they went to an aunt's house, and this aunt had a beautiful home, but not too far away there was. And why is it that these houses were always, like, that was my question, why are all these houses close to, like, cemeteries? Absolutely not. But anyway, this house was close to a cemetery. And so they go in, they're talking, the my grandmother's talking to her sister-in-law, yada yada. And you know they go to sleep the first night, and there's like a sound. They hear, like, my mom specifically, who, like, always loved getting into trouble when she was little. um she heard the sound. It sounded like a woman wailing. And there's a story about, like, las animas, which are the spirits, and they say that around, like, the witching hour, that the animas come out to kind of mourn, um, because that's what they do. And so, and that's the kind of like folk tale or like, folklore, that the animas come out like at the witching hour to mourn the dead. And my mom hears this like long wail. And my mom, being my mom, she's like super curious. She like is trying to like take a look at where the sound is coming from, right? And far away, she sees a woman. She looks into the she looks into the give me one second, let me try to she looks into the area that's like, because like her bedroom door gave out to that part, to the cemetery. So she looks out the window, and from far away she can make out like almost like a figure of a woman kind of wearing this wispy white dress as she's walking through the cemetery. And she's trying to like wake up her other two sisters. So like my mom and my two aunts, they're like a year apart. No, they're 2 years apart. Sorry. So they're pretty close in age. Was it 2 years apart? Yes. Yes, they are 2 years apart. Each one is 2 years apart, exactly. And so like my mom being the eldest, she was like trying to like get these two to like wake up. And my mom was like probably like 9, 10 years old. And so she's like, oh my God, I can see it. Right. Like she got super excited. And the other two are like just knocked out. They're like, absolutely not. Leave me alone. Like, get out of here. And so the next morning, my mom is plotting with my two aunts, her two sisters, saying like, I'm gonna go check it out again. So the thing is, like, the houses back in like those kinds of houses, they had like these kinds of like windows with shutters. Like these are colonial homes. If you imagine colonial homes, they have these shutters, and the shutters are like slats, but you can look through the slats. And that's how my mom saw the that woman in white. And so she like goes and she's plotting the next morning when she wakes up, like, I'm gonna do this and yada yada. I'm gonna go find her, right? I'm gonna go look at her again. And so I don't know, like I think like my 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 grandfather's sister hears them, and she like kind of sits my grandmother down and says like, be careful, because like it's spoken about in town that anybody that sees that woman in white walking across the sorry the the cemetery, their souls get snatched. Now I understand so much. Sorry. Anyway. Their souls get snatched. Yo. Let me not joke like that. Oh my God. Why does my hair look like this? Anyway. So my grandmother basically puts a stop on it immediately. So now a little bit of backstory with my mom. My mom, I guess you would call her that she had certain kinds of gifts growing up, and this is why all these things were happening. I don't know. You make your decision. I'm just telling the stories. But now we know why my mom was like she anyway. So ooh, hello. Okay, so that's the story of the lady in white. The next story is, oh yes, the stories about my grandfather's lands. this is a really interesting story. So I recently told like a little background story to something that's like going on in my life and kind of like the chisme of what's going on my TikTok channel. So if you want to follow me there, you can totally follow me there. But this particular story is really interesting because this happened to my grandmother. And my grandmother is somebody that does not believe in anything. Or she didn't believe in anything, right? Like she was just like, yeah, no, that's not real. um I mean, she believed in some things, but like maybe not everything. But my grandmother was quite young when this happened in terms of like, a youth. She had already had kids at that point. And so my so a little backstory to my grandfather. My grandfather was a self-made man, right? Like he was a business owner. He started out really like selling fruit from like what I heard. My grandfather started out like selling fruit. But not like being a fruit seller, just a fruit seller. Like he would have like, you know, a truck full of fruits, right? And then he would sell them in Venezuela. But little by little, he started getting like another truck, and then had a whole fleet, and he had people working for him under that fleet. It Eventually he had a company of like, fruit sellers and a whole fleet of like, going in and out. Eventually he sold that business because what he truly wanted to do was have like a restaurant, a whole bunch of series of restaurants. So he takes the money from the sale of that previous business and he goes to Valencia. So for those of you that don't know the way Venezuela is, there's like several like larger cities, maybe not as large as like Caracas, but like Valencia is like, it's not super small. It still has like a small town feel. Let's call it Las Vegas, right? Las Vegas is like feels like a small town. Like it only has the strip really. And that's basically it, right? But it's still considered like a city ish, city adjacent. It isn't New York. And in a lot of ways, Venezuela is very similar. So Valencia is one such city. So my grandfather um goes to Valencia and he buys like a whole block of businesses. So he creates a billiards business. He creates like a restaurant bar, like those are very popular in Venezuela, like where there's like a bar section and then there's like the restaurant section. It's not any different than here. Um, and then he had like a different kind of like, business. So all of these businesses took up like a whole block of this place. And so he would like, because he always needed to be there, he would like go back and forth between Caracas, where like, my mom and her sisters were going to school, and my grandmother lived between Caracas and Valencia. Obviously, that would create issues later on, including cheating, but like we don't judge. We don't judge our ancestors. Um, so what happened in these businesses, but like from time to time, shoot, running out of juice. So what would happen was that sorry, I lost my train of thought. So one such weekend, my grandfather, um they're at the restaurant. That's what it is. So the restaurant had so they were both my grandparents were at the restaurant, and my grandfather had like, this game of billiards at the billiards place. No, he had a game of like domino. at the billiards place. He's like, "Oh, I'm gonna go with the guys, right? Like, I'm gonna go play. You can stay here, but I'm gonna lock you in, right? Because you had to lock everything in to be safe so that like nothing gets stolen. And so I'm gonna lock you in. And so he did that. Why shouldn't I have keys? I don't know. Don't ask me. I think it was like something like you couldn't lock from the inside, but you had to lock from the outside. So that there was no way to like, I don't know. Anyway, the point is that my grandmother gets locked into the restaurant, right? And the restaurant had like this little room, and so like she could stay there until he would come back and pick her up, right? And as she's like putting stuff away, she starts hearing strange sounds. At first it was like almost like dripping, like a dripping. It's like drip, 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 drip. And she was like, "Oh, that's strange." Um, so she goes to the bathroom to check out if the drip is coming from there. Like maybe there's like a faucet issue, something like that. But no. She's like, "Oh, that's strange." And then the sound stops. And then the marble starts. And the marble is very interesting because I will teach you something, because there's another story attached to this story. So she hears a marble like almost like rolling off the roof. So she's like, you know, rolling, like it's rolling off, it's rolling off, it's rolling off. And almost like it falls into like a bucket. And then another one. It's like it like rolls off the roof and then falls into a bucket. And again, she's like, "Oh my God, those are like the stupid kids around the neighborhood. Like they're like, being, stupid." And so she goes and she calls my grandfather. She calls my grandfather, and like she can't get into contact with him. Something like that. And so again, like the sound, like ping, ping, ping. And then it stops, and it starts all over again. Anyway, all of this increments and gets like louder, and then she starts hearing like loud footsteps, to the point that she's like freaked the F out. She's like, "I don't know what's happening here. Like, get me out of here." She like gets so scared that she like sits in the window. So again, these are colonial times, these are colonial structured homes, especially in Valencia. We actually, side note, we actually had a great aunt who used to have like this huge colonial home in Valencia. And funny enough, it was like at the center, it was like all was the garden, and then there were like the hallways on the side, and the and on this side it was almost like a U-shaped house, but the house was closed off by like a wall. And so like on this side it was the kitchen, and then there were like the hallways, and behind and after the hallway, like the rooms were over here, and then there's like a little hallway, not a little, it was a large hallway. And like that took all over here, and then at the middle, in the middle section, was the the garden and the bathroom, which was like almost like an outhouse kind of thing, but it wasn't an outhouse. It was like, yeah, it was like a proper bathroom, but like almost like outhousey. I don't know how. And the shower was outside. It was like in the garden, which was like so interesting because I was like, "What is this? what kind of devilish work is this? Um, and so like you had to go out to take a shower in the garden. Obviously it was covered, but like you were still pretty much taking a shower in the garden. And I was just like, what in the world? Please get me back to civilization. I need to get back to New York. Thank you. I need my plumbing to be on the inside with walls and a roof. And the garden, because these were colonial structured homes, like that part of the garden did not have a roof. So like it was almost like the house was around the garden. Anyway, if you look up like Mexican colonial homes, you'll see some. Obviously, we're not talking about Mexico, but a lot of these colonial homes were very similar, throughout all of Latin America. Anyway, the point being, my grandmother gets so freaked out, which is why I'm telling you the story of the colonial home. She like she like sits at the window. So with these colonial homes, it's almost like a seated, like it's this long, it's like there's a place to sit so that you can actually kind of scooch into because there's usually like bars at the windows. And then where like there's a space between the bars, the bars of the window, and then like the shutters of the window. So there's like a space outside, but you're like outside, but you're like in the window, right? Like you can't get out because of the bars of the windows. I don't know what would have happened if like if there was a fire. Like that's completely. Anyway, the point being, she stays there, and all of a sudden, as she like shuts the shutters, all of a sudden things start shaking, and she's looking through it, and like it's all the pots and pans start moving in this freaking kitchen of this restaurant, and she is freaked the fuck out. Like she is so scared, and she's like, get me out of here. She can't get out because she's locked inside. There's nowhere to go. And and she like stays there until like 6 in the morning, when my grandfather finally decides to come back. And obviously they have a huge fight because she's like, oh my god, like, ah. And my grandfather, like the funny thing is, like, um usually happen, the men never believe. She tells him what happened, and he's like, okay, you're making that up, like that's not true, you're just mad at me. And she like, and it falls on deaf ears. Another story about the restaurant. So they say, so like the restaurant, like all these businesses. So my grandfather had so many businesses. When he passed away, he had a lot of businesses, restaurants, all these things, right? That they tried. My mom and her two sisters tried to kind of keep up. My mom lived in New York at that time, like when my grandfather was passing away. Which was during the time that like I actually was born in Caracas, because of the fact that she was like traveling back and forth every couple of months um to be able to see her father during his last months. And so that's how I was born there. But during this like 2-year period, when my grandfather was kind of slowly wasting away, he was like losing his sense of like, um he had these businesses that they tried their best to like run, but like they all had careers in Caracas, so they would come during the weekend, and there were people that were stealing. It was like a mess. It was a mess. Everybody was fighting over the like property. Typical thing, which is why like I told the chief mate and I like connected it to the story. But The story about this restaurant, much like a lot throughout Latin America, you have to recognize that Valencia um was part of like the coast, right? It was like a coastal town, I believe. And people would say that like a lot of like the men who were sailors would like bring gold and they would like bury it underneath. We have so many stories across time because like during the colonial period that there were no, as far as I know, like there weren't any banks. So they would save their money by hiding it. And when these people, would pass away, I guess, like, these ghost stories took more and more power because people believed that there was gold. And that's exactly what people always said about my grandfather's property, excuse me. They would always say that on that land there was buried treasure, and that was why there was so much spiritual activity or ghost activity in those businesses, because it was across the businesses. So here's the other story. So my I will say this, my cousin, my aunt and my mom got married really young. They were like babies. My mom got married when she was 19, as did my other aunts, as did my aunts. They all got married around the age of 19, 20. My mom got married and she got divorced like 6 months later. I don't know. Don't judge it. I don't judge. And so the youngest girl, which was my aunt, um, the youngest of the three, she had a boyfriend, and I don't even know how they allowed her to have a boyfriend so young, but she was pretty young when she had the boyfriend. And during the time when he was in college, she was in high school. Um, and she was a young high schooler. I'm not gonna say, but like she was a young high schooler. I was just like, excuse me? Anyway, did nobody did nobody have any sense? Common sense? Anyway, so so during that time, like they would, he would visit Valencia, because maybe sometimes the family would go to Valencia to visit my grandfather, and like the boyfriend, which is my godfather actually. He's my godfather. um the boyfriend, eventually my cousin's father and my godfather, would visit her because he was in college, and so on the weekends he would like visit her wherever she was, whether she was in Caracas or she was in Valencia. Normally they'd be in Valencia visiting my grandfather, the family, I mean, my mom, my aunt, my grandmother, my mom, and my two aunts. And so he would visit them, and he would stay, they would sleep in separate bedrooms, obviously. Jesus, at least that. Like, um but they one night he decides to stay in the restaurant, because in the restaurant there was like a little room with like a cot where you could stay and sleep, for any like, workers, I guess. I don't know. So he decided to stay in that building, in that restaurant where the thing happened with my grandmother. And so he goes to sleep. He like washes his face, brushes his teeth, does his like night routine, right? And then he goes and he lies down. And that's when it all started. And he hears a trickle. And he's like, I don't remember leaving the faucet on. And he goes to check. Nothing. Goes back to sleep. Like 30 minutes later, he hears like a marble. Ping, ping, ping. At this point, my godfather, God bless his soul, he's like freaked out because he's like always been like a little bit like a scaredy cat. Not a very courageous man, that one. And so he continues to hear this thing. And that's when the sounds start. Ironically, it starts a lot sooner for him. And the funny thing is when the marble starts hitting, so my godfather, TMI, just FYI, but he like would sleep naked. And it's Valencia, it's a tropical country, like it's hot, right? Like there were no like, AC units back then. And like bring he's like asleep. At one point he falls asleep, I don't know when, but the marble starts up again and then he gets like a marble thrown on his like naked ass. Like almost like somebody had like gotten like one of those little thingies like that like flings stuff, and he got hit on like his bum with the marble, and that wakes him up and he like shouts, he turns on the light, there's nothing. And that's when the sounds start. Like all of a sudden, like he heard outside of the room, right? Because the kitchen wasn't that far away, the pans going wild. And he hears like the stomping of feet. And this man, I don't know, this man has like gotten up, gotten dressed in record time, and gotten the hell out of there. He like left the restaurant, like the doors open and everything. He like got the hell out of there. Now, I don't know why my grandfather in that other story with my grandmother locked her in, but this guy was like, I'm out, bye. I don't know what happened. I don't know what the story with that was. Um, but this guy like jetted out. He got into his car and he drove the fuck back to Caracas that same night. That same night, guys. That same night. And when they asked him, the next time they were like, "Where is he? What's going on?" They knew nothing until like a week later, when he comes by, the house in Caracas, and he tells them the story of what happened. And obviously, my grandfather was like, "Absolutely not. That's like a lie. I don't know what's going on with him." The other story is also around Valencia. So my grandfather, along with like all these businesses that he also had a house because he needed a house to stay in, especially to, when like the girls would come from like Caracas, and the girls is what they were called, right? When the girls, las Serranos, right? Because my grandfather is Serrano, so Las Serranos would come from Caracas to Valencia. He needed a home for them to stay in. And the house was like, it was nice. It was like lovely, a colonial style home. And so they would stay there and like go back and forth. When my grandfather passes away, my dad was already with my mom, obviously, because like I was born like that period of time. My mom and dad were already together. They had met in New York, and during that time, like they lived for a short period in Venezuela, I believe. And so my dad decided to stay behind and like work at the restaurant. My dad, fuck, cancel, clear, delete. My grandfather passes away, and my dad stays in Valencia, kind of because they were still trying to keep the restaurant. Eventually, it got to be too much. There was like too much infighting. There was like, it was a hot mess. and they sell the business. They sell all the businesses, they sell the house, all of that gets sold, right? Because there's nobody there like full time. There were people skimming the top, like, there were like accusations. Anyway, the point being, according to my aunts, that was like a hellhole. That was like, it was constantly like a drain, like a business that was constantly draining money, and that, they had to put in money. And stories upon stories, everybody has their own perspective on what happened. I don't know, because I was a baby, so I don't care. I care about the ghost stories. But I think it's like an interesting kind of backstory to like the scary stories, you know what I mean? So my grandfather dies, and on his deathbed, so what happened between my grandparents, according to like, according to theory, there was like my grandfather, like there was a woman that like put like a like a what a curse, right? Like a love spell on him, and so he left the whole family. And so he left the family pretty destitute. The three girls, especially, that my aunt had to like start working when she was 13, the youngest one, the one with the boyfriend. Um I don't know how then like they got they like got together so that like, but at one point they were not on speaking terms. Um because and so my grandpa, who had all the money, pretty much left them without anything. They had the apartment in Caracas, and the girls had to go out to like get a job in order to like survive. My aunt was like my youngest aunt was like 13 when she started working. My other aunt was 15. She started as like a bookkeeper, which turned into like, she then became an accountant. She went back to school, she became an accountant, like through like help with the business owners and all of that. My mom, who was like the eldest, she was 17. But because she was about to finish college, I don't know, my mom's like super bright. Um, they were like, let's let her finish college. And when she finishes college, then, she can help us out. I don't know how the whole story went, like why then like her. Oh no, because she was like about she was my aunt was like really young, 13, when she had the boyfriend. And so then like that happened. The whole situation with my godfather and the marble on his ass. Anyway, so that's the backstory. There's people that believe that like there was love spells, but the reality is that my grandfather cheated on my grandmother, which is not hard to believe because you know he was not living in his home. He was going back and forth between two separate cities, right? And so he left them with nothing. And when he left them with nothing, he took all his money, and all the friends and all the people, they disappeared. The family members, they all disappeared, and they went with the person with the money. And so, cut to when he was passing away, my grandfather asked to see my grandmother. And my grandma was like, absolutely not. I have nothing. Like, and my mom was like, well, he's dying. My grandma was like a hard woman, obviously from like that kind of life. And she was like, absolutely not. When finally she decides to go, my grandfather passes away. And My dad was there. My dad and my aunt were both there. I think they were all there when he passed. But specifically, my aunt and my dad were in the house that he lived in because he ended up just living in that house in Valencia. Um oh by and karma was served because like the lady that like, like he cheated with, um she kicked him to the curb when he started getting sick. So karma was served. Um so the story goes that after he passed away in the house where he lived in Valencia, and the light that in the room that where he passed away, it kind of went out and it never turned back on. So creepy. I hate you. The light, the fucking light turns on that moment. So the light blew out and it never turned back on. And they would change the light bulb several times, and they like turn it on, and it would work for a short period of time, and then it would blow out again and again and again and again. My dad, who was then living right after my grandfather passed away in that house, would always hear, because my grandfather always like took a shower. He was like a very clean man. He like took showers twice a day, and he would always hear the shower, like the sound of the shower head being turned, and then the shower, like the water from the shower head being um turned on, right? Like the water running. And he would go and check, and it was the light wasn't on, nothing out of the ordinary. And one night, I got emotional. I don't know why. I don't know. Anyway, one night, my grandfather, towards the end of his, oh my god, I literally don't know why I got emotional. Let's give it a second. If not, I'm gonna have to go. Oh my god, it's an hour. Okay, I'm gonna finish the story with my grandfather, and then we're gonna cut it. So the story with my grandfather, like, so my grandfather, towards the end of his sickness, he had cirrhosis, would like had like he had slippers on, but he couldn't even lift his legs to walk. So he had a big belly. You know how like cirrhosis, people with cirrhosis have this big belly. And so he would like slide the slipper, like he would like slide his feet in order to walk, because he couldn't lift his like legs, he couldn't lift his like whatever, his feet. And so he would slide everywhere, and you could hear him coming, like shh, shh, shh. And my dad was like sleeping on the sofa, because I think my aunt was like in the room, in the other room, and nobody was sleeping in my grandfather's room. And my my dad was like, absolutely not. But like all of a sudden my father hears the the movement of the slippers of my grandfather. Mind you, my grandfather was already like dead. He had already passed away, and he could hear them coming down the the like the hallway. um and my dad said, "Ugh, like, rest in peace." He was like, oh my god, like, you need to go, you need to rest in peace. um What else? There was another story about my grandfather. I can't remember. Yes, the one with my mom. So during that time, like my mom, I think during the time that my grandfather passed away, because I have a few memories of my grandfather. I don't have many because I was very, very little. I was like 2 years old, max. I have a memory of him when he like um the day of his cemetery, the day that we went to like bury him. And the reason I remember is because I got the runs, guys, as a baby. Poor little baby me. And like, they were like running around, and like I remember like everybody running around trying to find me a bathroom. Anyway, and that's what I remember about that. I have another memory with my grandfather. I won't bore you with the details, but there you go. A little comedy with your side of scary story. The last story with my grandfather was he was so my mom, it was right after he passed away. My mom was crying and she was washing the dishes, and she was like, at this point she was in Caracas. And they had like, they had transferred him because he's buried in Caracas. So they had transferred his body from Valencia to Caracas. Um, and so then they had buried him, and she was like, and she was talking to, I guess, the memory of him. She was like, could you please, like, send me a sign that, you're okay? And all of a sudden, like, you know, as she's washing, like, in the moment she says, tell me you're okay, the curtain above the window, the curtain from the window in front of like where she's washing her dishes falls. And she was like, okay. Anyway, that's the story of my grandfather. Those are the next couple of scary stories. I have to look over, like, which ones I've told. The point being, like, I would like to turn all these stories into maybe a series of like, it's either a series or like a film, but I don't know because these are such disparate like stories. Some of them are interconnected, but like a lot of them aren't. That like maybe a series would probably be best. But I'm working on another project right now, so um, but this is the first part, right? Like kind of telling the story and seeing how the story is structured, and then eventually just writing the script. And because this is so connected to kind of like kind of growing up in living and being Venezuelan and like all of that. um and some of these stories are like obviously personal and familial. So, and I kind of like, I think like something I unpacked during this little episode of stories was that there was like I really liked the idea of like that backstory of like what was going on um in the family as these as these moments, spiritual, whatever, like ghostly entities were like experience were being had. I think it's really interesting. I think that was like a really interesting thing that I saw, that before I was like, oh, it's just the story and the story and the story. But I liked that backstory of like what was going on in the family, what, all of that stuff. Um, and how it like, sometimes it's like interconnected. I thought that was really interesting. Anyway, I'll see you guys later. I'm really not liking this thing. Um, oh, it's a lack of light. I don't like the I will say this with the live, I don't love um I don't love the quality of it. It's like it feels grainy. And I think I just might make these into I might just make these into like you know, film it with my video and then kind of upload it. But that's the thing, like if I upload at a higher thing, like then it's like it's no longer grainy, but then it takes forever to upload. Anyway. Bye guys. Thank you for being here.